Morning everybody from Baby and Million and me. Just wanted to see how you're all doing. I hope paper 2 wasn't just as bad as you thought it would be. And in the next few weeks I will be marking 180 of them, so I will know paper 2 inside out. In fact, I know it pretty well now myself. I didn't think it was awful, especially for research methods, which you all don't really love. But I hope that was okay. Listen, it's done and dusted now, thankfully, and you've got one more paper to go. And even if you think you've absolutely blown it in the first 2 papers, remember this is a third of your marks. So over the next 1, 2, 3 days that you have, put a wee bit of time into your 4 topics. So you've got issues and debates, you've got schizophrenia, you've got relationships, and you've got forensics. You'll see the questions when you go through the question paper. There's an example on Google Classroom for you. And you will answer these in a separate answer booklet. So make sure that you write down the question numbers that you're doing, okay, beside it. Usually in paper 3, they look for longer answers. So a lot of the time they will just give you an 8 marker and a 16 marker. Sometimes they give you shorter questions, especially when it comes to issues and debates, but a lot of the time it's just less questions, but more marks for each one of them. So you might end up getting an 8 and a 16, which would be your 24 marks for each section. Anyway, listen, when it comes to issues and debates, you've got your wee booklet, you can have a wee look through it, but especially focus on I've been looking through some of the possible predictions, and of course you need to know everything in the booklet, but they're suggesting that you should know gender bias and cultural bias. Alpha bias, where you accentuate the differences between males and females. Beta bias is where you minimise the difference. So for example, Ash's study did a study that was androcentric, it was on men, and then they just thought that would apply to women, but it doesn't always apply to women. Cultural bias then is how you should really do a study in the culture, all different types of culture, to get valid and reliable results. Most studies are done in Western Europe or in America, but do those findings then apply to India and China and different nations around the world? Strange Situation is a good example of that. But of course then somebody took Strange Situation and did it in Japan, they did it in Germany, and they got cultural variations from that. So that's gender bias. As well, there's a wee term called universality. And that all that means is that there are some universal things. We're all human. It doesn't matter whether we come from China, or whether we come from India, whether we come from Africa, or whether we come from Northern Ireland. We are human, and there are some similarities in the way that we all behave. But then of course you got your gender bias and your cultural bias, which balances that out. So have a wee look at that. I'm also going to put a link onto a little YouTube video. It's 15 minutes and it goes through all of the issues and debates generally. So it'll just, if you've 15 minutes, you can look through that. But I would suggest that my notes are better than that. So definitely make sure you go through those as well. One of the things they suggested looking at was free will versus determinism. Free will is the idea that I have some sort of choice in the decisions and the behaviours that I make, okay, and that's a humanistic view. Most of the approaches that we look at say that our behaviours are determined for us. So for example, the biological approach says that I have, say, depression. The reason for that is because I have lack of serotonin. That's a biologically reductionist view. However, we know that people with depression also have faulty cognition. And so that would suggest that there are other factors that are involved in my behaviours. It might be schizophrenia, it might be OCD, it might be depression. And therefore, so are behaviours determined, or do we have some sort of free will in the choices that we make? There's different types of them. You can see there's psychic determinism, which is to do with Freud, and you can have a wee look through those quickly and get a few examples of them from your notes. They also, a lot of the guys online have suggested that you look over the nature-nurture debate, and that's the same sort of thing again. Are my behaviours, am I a criminal? because my dad was a criminal and I have a criminal gene? That's the nature side of it. Or am I a criminal because I live in a home full of criminals and I have developed through social learning theory or by classical conditioning, I have learned the criminal lifestyle? Or is it a mixture of both? Okay. So have a wee look over the nature-nurture debate there, and you have lots of examples of that in your notes. OCD, schizophrenia, use the other things that you've learned to put in here to the debate. Holism versus reductionism is the idea again. These are very, very similar types of things. The holistic view is that we should look at a person completely. We look at their biology, we look at their cognitions, we look at the environment that they live in, and then we decide what factors affect their behaviours holistically. On the other hand, most approaches that we have looked at are reductionist. They try to reduce our behaviours down to one thing. It's my biology, it's my genes, it's my neurotransmitters, it's the way that my mum potty trained me, it's the house that I lived in or the street that I lived in. So that's the battle between holism and reductionism, and you can have a wee look at the different types there. Not the last wee one. There are two different approaches again. One is called ideographic and one is called nomothetic. Ideographic begins with I, and it's all about I. It's individual. Okay, it's when you study an individual and you like Clive Waring or like patient KF or HM or any of those individual cases that we've looked at. You get a lot of rich detail, but you can't apply it generally because it's a unique individual who's usually suffered trauma, and therefore we can't make generalizations. That's ideographic approach, so it's always case studies. The other approach is nomothetic, okay, and that's most of the studies that we've looked at are nomothetic. So strange situation, nomos means law, and what we're trying to do is we're trying to do a study and then establish universal laws that apply to everybody. Okay, they apply to Million in Ethiopia, and they apply to little Jemima here in Carrickfergus. So Ash's study, Milgram's study, strange situation, all of those things are trying to make established laws of the way that people will generally behave. And of course, there's cultural problems with that too. So that's ideographic versus nomothetic. And then the last wee thing that you could just look over, though it did come up, I think, last year as a 8-mark mini essay. There was a wee question about social sensitivity and the ethical implications of studies, how we should be socially sensitive. For example, Milgram's study, was it ethical when they was trying to get people to electrocute other people? And how can we be sensitive with our studies to society generally? Is it going to be appropriate? Is it going to be damaging to people? And you can have a wee look through that. And that is a really long video. But anyway, that's Issues and Debates. I'll be back with the other ones later. Bye now.